All right, here we are with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Got my coffee cup, and we, of course, have a great guest, another great guest joining us, a friend, a colleague, a true sister, Dr. June Christian. June, we've been doing these coffee talks as a way to introduce people to our WPC family. And so let's get started just by asking you, who are you? What do you do?
So as you've so graciously introduced me, I'm June Christian, and I've been actively doing diversity work since 2006. When I reflect on it back to elementary school, that's actually probably when I started doing diversity work unofficially. And what my work focuses on primarily is trauma and health and wellness. So understanding the impact of microaggressions, overt racism, and the trauma that's the psychic trauma that is absorbed, that we go through, and then what do we do? How do we mitigate that? The strategies that folks have in place in terms of health and wellness, and how they're going to move through those feelings. You know, the brain doesn't know the difference between a real threat or a perceived threat. So if you're experiencing overt racism or a microaggression, the body is processing that as it would if you were standing facing Freddy Krueger with his fingers, right? Like with his claws. So we have a due diligence in my mind to figure out how we're going to process those threats internally, and then also giving those strategies to other folks. So my formula may not work for you, but it may inspire you to figure out how you're going to process that trauma and get rid of all of the negative impacts, adverse impacts on the body, biologically, emotionally, and mentally. So that you can continue to prosper and be well and continue to do the good work that you're doing.
Now, I want to ask you about the health and wellness aspect. Like, how do you counter trauma through a health and wellness plan? Okay, so what are the things you suggest? What are the things you've seen people do? Or what are the things you do? But before I do that, I wanted to just ask you to define, like, what is trauma, right? Like, I think sometimes people have a different definition of what that is, what that means, as well as microaggression. So let's start with trauma. What is that?
So trauma is the experience of it's an adverse experience that has a negative impact on the body. The body absorbs that experience and then reacts in ways to biologically, mentally, psychically defeat that experience. So you could think of trauma as trauma is a bruise, right? Like at its very basis, you've got, you bump into the corner of the dresser, let's say, and there is something that's left behind. You've got a bruise there. Even if it doesn't necessarily show, there may be a pain point. That's exactly what I would say that racial trauma is, or oppressive trauma for that matter. It doesn't necessarily depend on race. It could be any identity. So something happens that confronts the very being, confronts the very identity of who you are. That's going to leave a mark. And so how do you deal with that? How do you process that? Because bruises, the interesting thing about bruises, the broken capillaries, they're going to heal themselves over. All of that, all of the broken capillaries, that blood stuff is going to be sloughed into the lymphatic system and it's going to go away. However, the psychic trauma, the emotional trauma, and to some degree the spiritual trauma of those events, whether it be race or gender or sexuality, that's going to stay behind. So what are we doing? The health and wellness aspect that I'm thinking around is, what are we doing to ensure that we're processing and sloughing off that negative stuff so we can continue to meet our obligations day to day and be happy, not just survive, but actually thrive. So microaggressions, I think, if you think about Jim Crow and overt racism, microaggressions are just kind of this morphing of those overt examples of degradation, oppression, marginalization, liminality, and now they're smaller microaggressions. So it would be more oftentimes than not, they happen in the workplace or happen with people who have who make comments. Sorry about that. I'm not quite sure who's at the door. People who have, who say things that might be offensive. So a microaggression, I'll give you an example. In an institution where I worked, everyone who hung on the wall, all of the presidents, all of the notable figures of the institution were all white men, and they hung them all on the walls. So no one had to say anything, no one had to do anything. That it's the microaggression is in who belongs here. And the unspoken idea is that I don't. Me as a Black woman with this natural hair, when you think about the longevity of the institution and who's been there before me, more often the thought is I am the first or one of the first of my kind, so to speak, being there. It reminds me of what W.E.B. Du Bois did when he traveled through Europe and he came back when he was the president in Atlanta, at Atlanta University. And he was very intent on hanging art that reflected the people who were there, because more oftentimes than not, Eddie, and you know this, when we go to the hallowed halls of institutions around this country, very rarely do we see upstanding people of color that line the walls unless it's a cultural center. Mm. So microaggressions can be anything from who's hanging on the wall to, oh, how did you, are you going to wear your hair like that in the meeting with the president? Or, oh, wow, I was thinking that maybe you'd put on a dress for that meeting that we're going to have. Anything that people can look at or specify that runs outside of dominant white, heterosexual, patriarchal culture, and drawing attention to those minor things. And it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts. You don't know that you've been cut until you find that you're bleeding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often think that microaggression is oxymoronic. I mean, when you think about the amount of pain and injury that can come from 1,000 cuts, it seems that we're not quite capturing that with microaggressions, but I get the concept. The thing I wanted to ask you about is what do you do, like the health and well-being, right? You may not be able to avoid going into the halls of power and seeing a reminder that you don't belong here.
Sure.
So what do I do? How do I take care? You talked about health, wellness. What does that mean when you have to deal with the cuts every day.
Sure. So I think part of that is recognizing that my recipe for self-care is going to look very different than anyone else's recipe for self-care, but it is the active pursuit of that recipe, the things that I'm going to do to ensure that I'm okay. So if I've got to go in these halls, if that's the way that I make my living, then what am I going to do to withstand it? So do I need to put some salve on my skin before I go in so that those cuts don't go as deep, or I'm prepared for the cuts when I get them? Do I need to wear a long sleeve shirt? And I'm using that figuratively. So is it affirmations? Is it the foods we eat that prepare our brains to function in phenomenal and direct and efficient ways? Is it making sure that I'm moving my body and lowering my stress level? Is it breathing techniques? Is it meditation? What does it look like? It could be any number of things. Is it, in the COVID era, perhaps we have friends or family members who can massage our hands, our feet, our back, whatever it is. I practiced as a licensed massage therapist a while ago, and one of the most important things that I learned from one of the instructors was that our issues are in our tissues. So if we're not moving, and that could be walking, it could be running, it could be on the elliptical, it could be joyful movement, whatever your body is capable of doing, but with the understanding that you are moving your body, because when you move your body, you are exercising your lymphatic system, and your lymphatic system is basically the garbage disposal of the body. There's no pump to move the lymphatic system like the circulatory system has the heart. So the ways in which we slough that dead stuff, the stuff that we no longer need, including that psychic detriment, that spiritual hurt, the traumas that we experience, the microaggressions that we experience, the way that we move is by moving our bodies. So if you have to turn on your favorite song and get it out, then that's the way you do it. If you raise your hands, whatever it is. And then also, what does your deep breathing, meditation, prayer life, whatever that looks like for you, ensuring that you have these things in place so that when you go into what's considered a hostile environment, even if on its face it doesn't appear to be hostile, but you experience hostility every so often, what do you have in place to make sure that that works for you? So I think just one of the questions that you asked around what do, so I have changed the way that I eat. It's been vital and important for me to ensure that my brain is functioning at its highest level, so that when I'm encountering microaggressions, when I'm encountering the world, when I'm encountering seeing Black men being killed and, virtual lynchings in essence, that I am able to think through what's my next step, what's my next best step. Then also I move every day. There's not a day that I don't get out in nature and move. And that's my prayer. That's my meditation. I'm usually walking my dog, and he allows me to slow down, and he sniffs the grass and I try to smell the roses. It's really focusing and meditation and being outside regardless of what the weather looks like. I also exercise 5 to 6 times a week. I make sure that I'm drinking water. All of those things are healthy habits that I think when we get into this work that we don't necessarily discuss. We have an idea around, we should be meditating, we should have affirmations, but food and water, those are important areas that we really do need to focus on in order for us to be happy and healthy and to thrive and to really rise above a lot of the things that we're encountering today, especially all of these young people who are being murdered. Nina Pop in St. Louis and the gentleman in Indiana. This is tough stuff. And if we're not willing to have the conversations around what we're doing to our bodies and how we're going to survive this, and giving those traditions and those habits to our young people and ensuring that they are focusing on their health, their physical health in addition to their mental and emotional health, then we are doing them a disservice, because all we're saying is you can survive trauma. The message that we need to convey in my mind is you can thrive through this. You can move through this. And here are the ways. This is my recipe. So you need to figure out what works for you.
I wanted to ask you about how your work has changed in reference to COVID-19. I mean, it seems like there's more in the air, and you mentioned some recent current events. I mean, I think that on top of COVID-19, I know for myself, it's pun intended more, but before I do that, I love issues in tissues. I want to hashtag that. I like that. But what I wanted to ask you is, did you grow up thinking this is what I want to do? How did you get to this point? I mean, what's the journey to go from where you started growing up to where you are now doing the kind of work you're doing?
So I never intended to be here. And if you had told me probably even 5 years ago that I'd be focused on health and wellness, I would have laughed. Um, my mother was, both of my parents are from the South. My mom is from Arkansas. And so hearing those stories growing up, I never wanted to be in a predicament where I didn't have my voice. And she equipped my sister and I with a voice. So if we were experiencing something, we were to have a conversation with her and to push the boundary as much as we could without getting in trouble. And the good trouble is the trouble that she would advocate for on our behalf. So I've always had a consciousness around who I am and being very proud and very rooted in being a Black woman, and understanding that that is not without, there's a worldview that people can take regarding my identities. However, we were raised with a strong sense of confidence and a strong sense of self. And I didn't get into this work because of the confluence of my identities. My father was disabled. He was aphasic and paralyzed on the right side of his body. So disability issues hit home for me, and accessibility and making sure that we could get him places and how that was going to work. So it just became a natural fit through college. I thought that I was going to be the first Black woman on the Supreme Court. And then I was like, no, I don't really like law, after I had worked in a law firm for a while. And then that started my journey into education. I'd avoided education because my mom was a teacher. Her sisters were teachers. My father had a college professor, a superintendent, and another person who was education adjacent, and my uncle who was education adjacent. So I was trying to move away from education. And then I started teaching. From teaching, I watched the ways in which Black boys in the South were treated and how they were forming masculinity. So I went to school to take a look at that. That evolved into a study that I did on Du Bois's, W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Flame trilogy. And so I looked at the Black Flame trilogy, which was basically Du Bois's life by his own admission, written in historical fiction, but all of the important things that he had gleaned across his career with regard to race and gender, specifically in education, and looked at that and formulated a theory around dehumanization and how the current education system dehumanizes kids. Particularly Black kids. I would say all kids, because anytime you cannot locate your humanity in someone else, you are lacking humanity, or at least the connection with your own humanity. So I did the work with Du Bois. I was a visiting professor at a historically Black institution in Little Rock, and then worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center for a little while with their teaching tolerance project for a few years, and then went to New York. And I worked as the director for equity and inclusion at a school in New York, and moved home to better help support my mother as she aged. And I think this is why I have found myself in the health and wellness area or arena, is that I can see the impact of what caring for your health means, not only for you individually, but for the generations who are coming behind you. And if we're not having a clear-headed, even-keeled conversation about the trauma that we're suffering and how we are taking care of ourselves, we are missing the mark. Generations of kids will be without that information, and they'll be learning as they go. One of the best things, I think, my sense of self came from the things that my mother observed in the Jim Crow South, and what she lived through in the Jim Crow South. And so that's something that I inherited. from her, understanding who I was in this world and how to move in this world. And so if we're not giving the next generation everything that they need in order to be equipped to move forward, then it's just not going to work. Well, I won't say that it won't. We're not going to thrive.
Yeah.
And the world needs for us to thrive. If you think about Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres's The Miner's Canary, if you use that metaphor, if Black folks are the canary, and any combination or confluence of our identities, when we go into the mine, if the canary lives, then that means that the rest of the mine lives, that the mine isn't toxic. So we have our due diligence and responsibility to make sure that we are healthy. And that's one of the things that I've learned in my own process, and making sure that I go out and I scream at least once a week. More oftentimes than not, folks of color don't know what the sound of our scream, what it sounds like when we scream. And not that we need to, but how are you releasing what's pinned up inside? How do you get that out? There are just some things that, getting on the elliptical isn't going to solve. When you see a Black man gunned down in the middle of the street, getting on the elliptical or running a mile, that's not all. We got to get that out. And there's a mental and emotional toll that takes on us. And so the words, the anger, the fear, we've got to process that. We got to figure out how to do that. It's individual to everybody, but we have to start.
Well, it makes me want to ask you about, the work you're doing, the work you've done with us at the conference. We've had some challenging, continue to have some challenging things happen in our society. But now I think it's worth acknowledging COVID-19 is unlike anything we've ever experienced in our lifetime.
Sure.
And I'm wondering, how is your work? How are you feeling? What are you thinking as you look ahead the next 25 years? On top of what we're seeing now, almost Trayvon Martin, St. Louis, New York City, all these incidents that have happened over the last decade. Now seems like restarting again. Mm-hmm. So just from your vantage point, what are you thinking? What are you concerned about? What's going through your head as you watch what's playing out right before us right now?
So I think we aren't necessarily starting again, we're starting from experience. And the best thing about people who often are pushed to the margins or who are living liminal experiences, the creativity is nothing new for us. So when you look at COVID, and just as an aside, I think that's another reason why health is so important when you think of the comorbidities that people are experiencing and how COVID impacts communities, specifically Black folks, brown folks who are living with other diseases. It's important for us to take our health seriously and to move forward. I think COVID helps us to figure out how to connect in ways that are meaningful and important, that may not necessarily be face-to-face, but the opportunity to have this opportunity to fellowship with you right now, to converse with you, that's vital. And also the psychic detriment of being in the same place all the time. For some of us, I have the grand opportunity to work from home, so much hasn't shifted for me. But for many of us, we're completely changing our lives. There's something that's going on with us when we have to stay in the house. It's one thing to choose to be there. It's another thing when somebody tells you to be there. So really thinking through, processing the feelings that we have and not being afraid to run from them. I think for so long, we focus on our area, particularly If it's gender, then I'm gonna hit gender, and I'm gonna hit gender hard. But it's really the confluence of our identities. It's the confluence of who we are. It's the validation of humanity through walking a mile in someone else's shoes. And I think we've got to be prepared to withstand this a little bit longer, and to overcome the challenge that's before us. And I think that this isn't anything new for communities of color and oppressed communities. This is nothing new, but for some, it is.
So, and thinking about communicating to young people who, at least for them, may be experiencing COVID-19 in a way because of their limited life experience, they've never really had to deal with shelter in place, so to speak. So if you have a chance to speak to young people, who may be listening or tuning in, what's your message to young people about this time in the time ahead?
Know that you will persevere. I think having the confidence, the sense of self, the understanding that a lot of what we encounter is what we make of it in our brains first. So create an environment, surround yourself with people and thoughts and feelings that will edify you in the highest regard, right? So take care of yourself, move. If that means walking around the block, if it means walking, from the kitchen to your bed and back and forth, move. That's the first thing that needs to happen. You need to get yourself up and get yourself running. Find the healthiest foods that you can. Because the only way that you're going to be able to survive this is if your brain is clicking on all cylinders. And the easiest way to do that is making sure that you are feeding yourself the most nutritious foods that you have possible. Think positive thoughts and find people who are moving and thinking and being in similar ways. So don't find folks who are depressed and feeling sad and down and low. Give them time, because everybody needs to be heard, but surround yourself with people who are moving and moving positively. Yeah, I think that would be the things that I would say. And to fill your brain with the history. Find out everything you can about what's happened before this time, because ultimately, I just read something this morning, Eddie, that said that some of us are still being covered by our grandparents' prayers. And in order to understand this moment and how we've arrived here, the easiest way to understand that, to make sense of it, and to ground yourself is through the history of it. I think that I would be lost if I hadn't done the work, if I hadn't read Ida Wells Barnett, if I hadn't read W.E.B. Du Bois. Black Reconstruction, it's a huge book, but it's a definite read. If you want to understand Black folks right now, read that book, published in the late 1800s, right? Or the early 1900s. So feed your mind, not just with good foods and nutritious foods. Feed your mind educate yourself around what's going on, and also know the issues. One of the things that I think emerged so wonderfully from the shootings in Florida was this youth movement. And so you're a part of that youth movement. If you're a young person, you're a part of it. So what can you do? Instead of worrying, instead of being fearful, if you can take those emotions and channel them in a way that's positive, what would you do? What could you do? And then do it.
Now, one of the things I've learned from you most recently that continues to stick with me is the importance and the power of laughter.
Yeah.
in our laugh yoga classes. I remember you talking about the science of laughter, though, and that was so useful for me to remember that it's not just good to have stuff funny around you, it's actually possibly healthy. So can you just talk a little bit about the science of laughter, your philosophy around that,
Sure.
and share it with folks who may be watching?
Sure. So the great thing about when you laugh is that your body doesn't know the difference between a fake laugh and a real laugh. So your brain is releasing the same endorphins that it would anytime you laugh. So when you're faced with a difficult situation, now it's not always the smartest thing to laugh in the moment, but when you laugh, it allows your brain to work at an optimal level. When you smile, the same endorphins are released if it was a fake smile or a real smile. And oftentimes, what I think is really interesting, Eddie, is that when folks are in a dire situation, sometimes they laugh, sometimes they'll smile, and it seems off. And people are like, "What's happening?" It's actually the body's biological response to get you thinking and feeling better. It actually will help move you from a state of inertia, or when you're immobile, to being able to move, to being able to embrace and think about what's going on around you. So laughter, it's key, it's vital. If you can't find something to laugh about, laugh anyway. um, it's one of the things that I try to get into my day several times a day is, if I'm not laughing, is there something I can smile about? Because usually there is. You know, you can think about the folks that love you best. You can always find something on the internet to laugh and smile about, even if it's not necessarily intended to be funny. I think I find myself laughing and smiling a lot about the political situation right now. Not that it's not enough to move me to tears, but smiling, I remember, okay, let me kick my brain into something so that I can move past this, the worry, the blame, the shame, the guilt, whatever's coming up around what's going on around me. I can mitigate that with a smile or with a laugh. And you can fake it till you make it. And the best thing is when you can laugh with someone else. So just getting together just to laugh, whether it be on a Zoom call, on a phone call, or the folks that you are sheltering in place with, getting that laugh in is going to make you smarter, and it's going to make you healthier.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Can you tell people how we find you? Where are you? What's the way we can get a sense of all the great things you're doing? And what's in the future? What do you got planned? What's coming up over the next 10 years as you think about Dr. June Christian?
So right now, you can reach me at thedrjune.com. Super simple. That's my website. And the next 10 years, I'm actually studying to be a board certified health and wellness coach. And I think that it is, like I've said, you know, Eddie, I think since the last time I saw you, I have lost about 35 pounds. And it's been really important for me to get my health under my control, and so that I can feel good about how I move in the world. And I want to help people do that. And I want to specifically help communities of color. So bringing together all of these modalities that I've collected over my life and never knew what I was doing this for, right? Like bringing all of these things together, from being a licensed massage therapist to the health and wellness coaching that I'm actually doing now. And as well as studying for it, the laughter yoga, and also a meditation practice called Yoga Nidra, which is what they call yogic sleep. So you put your body to sleep and you allow your intuition, your internal voice to take over. And it helps to heal the body and it helps to heal the mind. So putting all of those things together and really starting to offer folks the opportunity to come together, to coalesce in whatever way that looks like. Hopefully, in the next 5 years, we'll be able to coalesce face to face. But if that's not the case, bringing people together so that we can have these conversations and we can get healthy together in all ways and all pathways.
Yeah, well, anything the White Privilege Conference, the Privilege Institute can do to be in partnership with you, let us know. We still consider you our health and well-being initiative leader on a little sabbatical, but we got a placeholder for your name, and we would welcome you back when you're ready. And I've always appreciated you since the time you were at the Law Center and doing the things you were doing in other places to now supporting me in the conference. So again, anything we can do to stay in collaboration. And I wanted to just ask you some quick things. I'm just gonna say something and ask you to respond in 15, 30 seconds. Just put a word out there, a thought out there. First one is, are you going with Beyonce or Whitney Houston?
Oh, Whitney Houston. I love Beyonce. I love her, but Whitney Houston.
Whitney Houston. Let me ask you, what's your thought on colorism?
There's lots of work we need to do across all communities around colorism. And we are doing the greatest disservice to ourselves by feeding into the narrative that color matters and the validation of our humanity.
What about code switching? What's your thought on code switching?
I would love to get to the point where it is no longer necessary.
Yeah. Now, why is the health and wellness area so white? I mean, it's like white yoga, it's like white fitness shows. Give me your thoughts on the diversifying health and wellness from a visual perspective.
So I think that why the space is so white, one of the reasons is that there's a lot of co-opting that's happening. So when you think about yoga and the idea that yoga is a broad system, a way of living, it's not simply postures, asanas, or breath practices. It includes eating and the ways in which we deal with the mind and meditation and all of these things together. However, it's been reduced to moving our bodies, right? And the certification around people who this body of knowledge didn't originate with. Mm-hmm. And I think there's the idea around what health looks like and who is healthy and how that's determined. So when you've got a certifying body, when you create a certifying body, then you become the authority on who can do what. It's starting to brown, I'll say a little bit. And the other thing too is that many of the healing practices that communities of color have put in place have not been for a capitalist system. They have been for the healing and edification of the people that they come from. So health and healing in communities of color has been happening since we've been alive, right? Mm-hmm. Like since human beings have been around. But what that looks like in terms of a stage and having people to look and view, I think that's been taken over, and that's been a space that particularly white folks have exercised privilege in. But you can think about, at least I can in my short life, the salves that my grandmothers would put together. So if there was something, growing up with cod liver oil, I don't know how many young people have had that experience, but when your stomach was hurting, did you ever get cod liver oil, Eddie?
I got some stuff. My grandma, she was cooking up something.
Exactly. And so
yeah.
It's always existed. It's always been around. And I also think that there's a difference between wanting to get paid to do this work, and not that there's anything wrong with that, because money is an energy, that's my belief, but there's also something to be said for wanting to heal a people and helping them to thrive, which doesn't necessarily need a monetary benefit. It is just the perpetuation of humanity in a way that is kind and compassionate and forward thinking.
Yeah. You know, it's amazing. I think about like the conferences or the learning spaces that you are providing. And sometimes people provide a sliding scale because they know some people can't get into it and they know it's a benefit. It can benefit all of us. You know, I wish Peloton would do that. You know what I'm saying? I wish some kind of yoga would do it. The new mirror fitness program, right? Like provide some access to people in ways that provides this service to a broader community. It's just something I've been thinking about, and thank you for sharing that. Last thing I'll ask you to respond to is Black Girl Magic. What comes up when you hear that hashtag Black Girl Magic?
So because I'm a Black girl, I would love to, I think that we're magical. However, you know, Eddie, I just had a conversation with a young woman who used to be my neighbor. She's now grown and off in the world. And she said that it hurts her to her core, because why do we have to be magical in order to have import and impact? And it really made me think through, you know, what does it mean to be magical? And, you know, I think that Black girl magic is something that I inherited. It's not something that I have or that I cultivate. It comes from standing on the shoulders of women who loved and prayed and toiled and did everything they could to get me to this moment. So I'm caught between understanding that everything that I have is something that I inherited, and we shouldn't have to be seen as magical in order to be important, in order to be cared about, and in order to be seen.
I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you, as the father of a 2-year-old Black girl, and really trying to, you know, understand the embracing of that and what that all means. That's really helpful. Dr. June, one last thing.
Yes.
One last thing. We've been asking people, what have you been watching? What have you been reading? What have you been listening to? Is there anything you want to add? I got extra time on quarantine, so here's what you got to check out. Here's what I found. Here's what I've been binging. Here's what I've been reading. Here's what I've been listening to. Anything you want to add to our list?
That is such an interesting question. So I'll say this: I've been studying for the health and wellness board exam. So my books are pretty boring around health and coaching and motivational interviewing. However, let's see, the series that I've been binging is Ozark, surprisingly. But I'll also say, to be fair, I'm from Missouri, and I've lived a good deal of my life in different parts of Missouri. So it is quite interesting. And, you know, when you have these lenses, it's tough to take them off and to see it for what it's not, or just to have a good time with it. And then I also saw, I've forgotten the title of it, I think it's The Secret Affair. It's about two women and their 75-year, multi-decade relationship that they kept secret until just recently, probably within the last 10 years. And that was very touching. And it's also an interesting story about aging and what aging looks like. So those would be my two. And just a little bit of self-promotion. I also had to get back into my book, Understanding the Black Flame Trilogy and Multigenerational Education Trauma Toward a Theory of the Dehumanization of Black Students, because I was thinking, particularly with the death of Ahmaud Arbery, around the reading around lynching that I did. James Cone, Ida Wells Barnett, W.E.B. Du Bois, the NAACP, particularly in its early inception, and the catalog that they did around lynching, the detailing of lynching in the United States. This is nothing new.
Wow.
You know, like they say, nothing new under the sun. So just reminding myself. So if you don't check me out, at least check out those primary resources, and especially Ida Wells Barnett and Du Bois.
Dr. June, we appreciate you. You take care of yourself. You be safe. We'll look forward to seeing more spectacular out of you. And again, of course, remaining connected and collaborating and impacting in the future. Thank you, Dr. June. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.